Pilgrims, as we have stated, came here earlier. The Puritans were given their name because it was said that they wanted to purify or bring out, as they saw it, the imperfections that were in the doctrine of the Anglican Church and make it to what they believe the faith values ought to be. Well, the Puritans were a much larger group than the Pilgrims. They established the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1629 with 400 settlers. Within 20 years, more than 20,000 Puritans had sailed to New England area as part of the Great Migration. Fleeing the Church of England, they sought to establish a new, pure church in the New World. Their goal was to be a nation of saints, a city upon a hill that shone the light of a thoroughly religious community as an example to all of Europe. They hoped the colonies would become a Redeemer nation. The Puritans that later would be in step with the likes of Jonathan Edwards, who wrote Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, and some of those great preachers that really preached with such fervor and such boldness. I believe that when you go back there and you look at their preaching, it was said that it's a poor sermon that neither offends the preacher nor the listener. And so they spoke truth to error, and they did it with full conviction, not believing in what we today term political correctness. They hewed to the lines of truth and let the chips fall where they may. The Great Awakening that started during the 1730s and 1740s was a revival movement that simply blazed through the colleges. Most pastors before this period merely read their theologically dense sermons. Jonathan Edwards, he ignited a spiritual resurgence with a fervor to not merely engage the congregation mentally, but to an aroused and emotional response leading to genuine repentance. This Massachusetts preacher looked back to the strict teachings of the Pilgrims and sought to resurrect the fear of God. Edwards was joined by other itinerant preachers, the British preacher George Whitefield among them, who traveled across the colonies with their passionate preaching, bringing a theme of repentance and spiritual renewal. It was said that George Whitefield could be heard at such long distances that people would beg him to preach longer. I was able to visit his home up in New England, and George Whitefield was asked to preach. He died in 1754. He was born in 1714. And George Whitefield was asked to preach, and he said, "I'll preach until the candle goes out." And the next morning they found him at the head of the stairs. George Whitefield, and I often wondered, how did those ideas of freedom get incorporated into the documents like the Declaration of Independence? And you know what I found out, friend? That the printer, Benjamin Franklin, in his newspaper, the Gazette, Benjamin Franklin was printing the sermons of men like Whitefield and some of these other preachers that traveled. Later on, it would be men like Shubal Stearns. Of course, we had men like John Leland that had helped James Madison write the First Amendment to the Constitution for religious freedom. Well, these preachers, they had such a good understanding. They knew that freedom must be the fabric that was interwoven throughout the tapestry of our government and all of our affairs, or we just would not make it. And so today we have to maintain that spirit of freedom. We cannot allow churches to have to obey mandates that are arbitrarily executed by governors and mayors that would close us down for any or whatever reason. I know there are health needs, but when we can get to the point where that we can tell churches and pastors that they can only have a certain number, or that they can only meet and not even be permitted to meet in their homes for prayer study or whatever, Bible study, government has gone too far. Let me say it like this: when the people fear the government, there's tyranny. And when the government fears the people, we have freedom and democracy. And so I think as we study this great awakening that went throughout the colonies, it was like a wildfire raging. So many men got a great start there, as we said, and later that influence would go on down into the Carolinas and Kentucky, later on with Mordecai Ham and others. We need a spiritual awakening today. We need a revival in America where the man of God stands between the dying and the living, stands in the pulpit proudly and with great fervor, and says with great audacity that we're here to say, "Thus saith the Lord." And we've got to stand against a decadent society. We've got to stand against a series of dying churches that we see that's been permeated with social gospels. And we've got to stand against a culture that's becoming more and more demonic. I believe that we have a great responsibility, but we can do it with God's help. We can't do it alone, but He is able to do exceeding abundantly above all that we ask or think.